My name is Elara. I'm 28 years old. It was supposed to be the most important business dinner of my husband's career. 200 guests, the deal that would define his company's future, and my mother-in-law stood up in the middle of it all and read a letter out loud. A letter she claimed I had written, about how I had planned everything, married her son for access, for money, for the life I could never have on my own. She read every word slowly, making sure the room heard each one. My husband sat next to me and didn't move. When I reached for his hand, he pulled it away. I didn't cry, not right then. I just reached for my phone under the table and dialed the one number I had promised myself I wouldn't use. "Dad," I said, "I need you here." And when my father walked through those doors 40 minutes later, the color drained from every face in that room, starting with my mother-in-law's. Before I tell you how that night unraveled, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to HeartPath Stories. Drop your country in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. I met my husband 3 years ago at a regional finance conference in Chicago. I was there representing the firm where I worked as an analyst. He was there with a presentation about his family's company, a mid-sized manufacturing business they had built over 3 decades. We got to talking during the cocktail hour, and something about him just felt easy. He was funny in a low-key way. Not the kind of man who needed to own the room, just the kind who noticed things. He noticed me, specifically, standing near the window by myself, watching the skyline. He walked over with 2 glasses of sparkling water and said, "You look like someone who'd rather be anywhere else." I laughed, and that was the beginning. We dated for 8 months before I told him about my father. Or rather, before I told him the version I had decided to share. Here's the thing about my father, and I want to be honest about this, because it matters for everything that comes after. He was not a known name. He wasn't on billboards. He didn't do interviews. He had spent his entire career building quietly, accumulating control of one of the most significant private investment funds on the East Coast, and he had done it almost entirely out of public view. That was intentional. It was simply who he was. And for most of my adult life, I had chosen to live the same way. When I started working in finance, I used my mother's last name. My father supported that decision completely. We had a kind of understanding. I would build my own life, my own resume, and he would let me. If I ever truly needed him, I would call. But until then, I was on my own. That wasn't something he forced on me. It was something I asked for. So when my husband asked about family early in our relationship, I kept it simple. I told him my father was retired, that he lived quietly, and that we weren't especially close. It wasn't entirely a lie. It was just the smallest possible version of the truth. I didn't tell him the rest because I needed to know that he was choosing me. Not a connection, not a name. Not the invisible doors a name like my father's could open. Just me. And for a while, I truly believed he had. We got engaged on a Sunday morning in our apartment. No grand gesture, no restaurant, just him sitting across from me at the kitchen table, with coffee going cold and a ring he'd been keeping in his sock drawer for 2 weeks. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My father came to our wedding. He sat in the 3rd row, listed in the program under my mother's last name, the one I used professionally. And no one connected him to anything larger. My husband shook his hand during the reception and made small talk about the weather. My father was polite, warm in a quiet way, and left before the dancing started. That was our agreement. That was what I had asked for. What I hadn't asked for, and couldn't have prepared myself for, was my mother-in-law. She started on the drive home from the rehearsal dinner. My husband was parking the car, and she was in the back seat next to me, and she said, very casually, without even looking over, "I hope you understand what you're marrying into. This family has a reputation to protect." I remember thinking it was nerves. People say strange things the night before a wedding. It wasn't nerves. In the first year of our marriage, she was careful about it. The way someone is careful when they're not yet sure how far they can go. Comments that sounded like concern. Comments that sounded like observation. Comments that were neither, but dressed themselves up as both. My son could have had anyone, you know. I just want to make sure he's happy. I smiled through all of it. I told myself she needed time. I told myself I could prove myself. I told myself that my husband saw it, even if he didn't say anything. That his silence was conflict avoidance, not agreement. But somewhere in the second year, she stopped being careful. She started saying things at the dinner table with other people present. Little corrections, my opinions, the way I held a wine glass, the backgrounds of people I mentioned as friends. Once, at a family gathering, she told the room that my husband had given up quite a lot to be with me and that she admired his patience. She said it like a compliment to him. Everyone laughed like it was a compliment to him. I looked at my husband across the table and he was laughing too. That night I told him what it felt like. He said I was being too sensitive, that his mother meant well, that I needed to understand she came from a different generation and a different world. I stopped telling him things after that. Looking back, and I've thought about this a great deal since everything happened. I know the question people ask most is, why didn't you leave sooner? I've asked myself the same thing plenty of times. But the honest answer is that I was still waiting. Waiting for him to become the person I had met at that conference. Waiting for the version of him that had walked over with 2 glasses of water and known, without being told, that I needed someone to notice me. Love makes you wait for things that have already stopped existing. And by the time you understand they're gone, you've been waiting so long that leaving feels like surrendering something real. Even when what you'd be surrendering is just the idea of something that was never actually there. The dinner was announced 3 months before it happened. My husband's company was deep in negotiations with a consortium of investors for a major expansion. New facilities, long-term contracts, the kind of deal that would change everything for them. The lead firm in the consortium was called Callaway Veer Capital. My husband had been working toward this for 2 years. This dinner was the final step before the agreements were signed. 200 guests, a private ballroom in downtown. A formal evening that was as much about impression as it was about numbers. My mother-in-law was heavily involved in the planning. She called it the most important night in the family's history. I want to say I felt something wrong in the weeks before it happened. I did, but I couldn't name it. My mother-in-law was friendlier than usual, included me in conversations, asked my opinion on table arrangements and menu choices. My husband seemed lighter, more present. More like the person I had fallen in love with. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, and when it didn't, I started to believe that maybe we had finally turned a corner. The night of the dinner, I wore a deep green dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. The room was beautiful, candlelight, white linens, a string quartet near the entrance. My husband walked beside me, and for the first hour things were exactly as I'd hoped. He introduced me warmly. He kept his hand at my back. My mother-in-law was charming to everyone, including me. I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe tonight is the night everything finally settles. The speeches started around 9. The company's chairman spoke first, then one of the lead investors. My mother-in-law was scheduled last. A brief thank you to the guests. That was what my husband had told me. Brief. A few sentences. She stood up, and the room quieted immediately. She had that particular kind of presence. A woman who had spent 4 decades moving through rooms like this, and had learned exactly how to command one. She thanked the guests. She spoke about the company, about its history, about her son's vision. And then she paused, in the deliberate way of someone who wants the room to feel the weight of what comes next. I also want to take this moment, she said, to address something that has weighed on me for quite some time. I felt the shift before I understood it. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. I recently came across a letter, she said, her voice carrying easily through the room. A letter I believe was written before my son and his wife were married. I think the people in this room deserve to know the truth about the woman who married into this family. My hands went cold. She unfolded the paper, and she began to read. The letter was not real. I want to be clear about that because I know what people wonder. It was fabricated, carefully, convincingly, in language that sounded almost like me. A letter supposedly from me to a friend, laying out my reasons for pursuing my husband. Not love, strategy, his family's reputation, the life it would give me. Access to circles I could never enter on my own. She read every sentence slowly, clearly, making sure each word landed. The room was very still. When she finished, she folded the paper and looked at me across the tables. I'm sorry, she said, in a voice that was not sorry at all, But I couldn't allow this to continue. I looked at my husband. He was looking at the table. Not at me. At the white linen tablecloth in front of him. That was the moment. Not the letter. Not the room. Not the 200 faces turned in my direction. It was that. Him looking at the table. I had given him 2 years of loyalty and silence. 2 years of telling myself his inaction wasn't agreement. And in the one moment that required him to move, he looked at the table. I stood up. That letter, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, is not real. I didn't write it. I didn't look around the room when I said it. I looked at my mother-in-law, and I think you already know that. She smiled. It was a patient smile. The smile of someone who believes they have already won. I'm not going to argue with you here, I said. That's exactly what this was designed to produce. I picked up my bag. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that, the absence of shaking, and it clarified something in me. I walked out to the hallway, found a quiet corner near the coat check, sat down on a bench and looked at the marble floor for 30 seconds. Then I took out my phone. My father picked up on the second ring. I didn't explain very much. I said, Dad, I need you. The Harmon Ballroom downtown. Please come. A pause, then, I'm 40 minutes out. I'll be there. That was all. I went back into the room because I was not going to wait in a hallway. I found my seat, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, sat quietly while the murmuring settled back into something resembling conversation around me. People avoided looking directly at me, which meant they were watching me constantly from the side. My mother-in-law had moved toward the bar. My husband had not come to find me. I waited. 42 minutes later, the main doors opened. I had not told my father how to dress or what to do. I had just told him where to find me. He walked in the way he always walked into rooms. No announcement, no flourish, just a presence that settled everything around him into a different arrangement. He didn't scan the crowd. He found me immediately and walked over without pausing. He put his hand on my shoulder. Are you all right? He said, quietly enough that only I could hear. I'm all right, I said. He nodded once. Then he looked out at the room with the expression I had seen maybe 4 times in my life. The expression that meant someone had made a very serious miscalculation. The first person to recognize him was one of the investors from the consortium. I watched it happen from across the room. The man's face changed all at once and completely. He touched the arm of the colleague beside him. That man turned. And then the recognition moved through the room in a slow wave, quiet and certain, like a tide coming in. My mother-in-law felt the shift. She turned from her conversation near the bar and looked toward the entrance. She saw my father. I watched her try to place him. I could see the effort, the scanning, the moment it landed. And then I watched her go very still. My husband appeared at my left. He had noticed his mother's expression and come to investigate. He looked at my father for a long moment without speaking. Then, quietly, That's the managing director of Callaway Veer. I said nothing. The lead firm, he said. His voice had gone thin. The firm we've been in negotiations with for 2 years. He turned to me. Why is he? Why does he have his hand on your shoulder like that? Because he's my father, I said. The silence that followed was its own kind of event. My mother-in-law crossed the room. She was composed, I'll give her that. Chin up, expression carefully arranged. She addressed my father directly. I think there may have been a misunderstanding this evening. There was no misunderstanding, my father said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. My daughter called me. I came. He looked at her for a moment. His gaze was not angry. It was simply clear, the way the surface of still water is clear. I've been aware of this family for some time, he said. I knew who my daughter was marrying. I chose to let her make that decision because she asked me to. A pause. She wanted to be chosen for herself. My mother-in-law started to speak. My father continued. The letter you read tonight was not real. I believe you know that. He looked briefly at the investors who had moved closer to listen. The people in this room whose professional judgment I respect are, I'm certain, capable of drawing their own conclusions about this evening's events. As for Callaway Veer's position in the current negotiation, that will be reviewed. My husband stepped forward. Please, None of this was my decision. I want to be clear that I didn't. I know it wasn't your decision, my father said. He looked at my husband for a long, quiet moment. That's not actually the problem. My husband went silent. My father turned to me. He looked at my face the way he had always looked at my face when something was wrong. Checking. Making sure I was really okay, and not just holding myself together by will. You asked me to stay out of it, he said. For 2 years I stayed out of it. He stopped. I should have come sooner. No, I said. I needed to see it clearly myself. I needed it to be my conclusion, not yours. He understood that. He had always understood that about me. I turned to face my husband. He was looking at me now. Not at the table. At me. His eyes were doing something complicated. Some mixture of panic and grief, and the particular shame that comes when a person is finally asked to see themselves without softening. I didn't know about your father, he said. I swear I had no idea. I know you didn't, I said. That was my choice. I kept it from you because I wanted to know you were choosing me, not what came with me. I breathed. But that's not what I need to talk about right now. I looked at him steadily. You knew tonight was planned, I said. Or you knew something was coming. I've gone back through the last 3 months. The way things calmed down, the way your mother was suddenly warm to me, the way you kept telling me how important this night was going to be. You knew something was being arranged. And you said nothing. I paused. And when it happened, you sat beside me and you looked at the table. His jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. I spent 2 years, I said, telling myself your silence meant you were just avoiding conflict. That underneath it all, you were still on my side. I needed to believe that. I held on to that belief for much longer than I should have. But a person can only hold on to a belief that keeps costing them for so long before they have to set it down. Elara, please. I stood up for myself tonight, I said. For the first time in 2 years, in front of this room, I stood up, and you still didn't move. I let that sit for a moment. That told me everything I had been refusing to hear. I looked around the room one last time. The candlelight, the white linens, the 200 people who had come for a business dinner and had witnessed something else entirely. I came into this marriage with nothing you could see, I said, and I let my voice carry. No name anyone here recognized, no visible connections. And I thought for a while that was right, that if someone chose me without knowing any of it, that choice would mean something lasting. I looked at my husband. But a person who chooses you once and then lets you disappear piece by piece, that's not really a choice. That's just inertia dressed up as commitment. I buttoned my jacket. I'm not going to perform anger for this room, I said. I'm not interested in a scene. I looked at my mother-in-law then, directly. You planned this carefully. You thought that if you dismantled me publicly, in front of the people whose opinion matters most to this family, there would be nothing left of me. That I would just keep absorbing it, the way I had been absorbing things for 2 years, and eventually disappear. She held my gaze but said nothing. You didn't account for the possibility, I said, that I might simply be done. I walked to where my father stood. He offered his arm. I took it. We walked toward the doors together, and I did not look back. Not at my husband's expression, not at my mother-in-law's face, not at the room full of people who had watched all of it happen and said nothing. The doors opened. The night air outside was cool and immediate, the kind that resets something in your chest. I stopped on the steps for a moment. The city was quiet and indifferent in the way cities are at night, ongoing, unhurried, unimpressed by any single person's crisis or resolution. She thought the worst thing she could do to me was expose me, I said. My father waited beside me. She didn't understand, I said, that all she actually exposed was how much she needed me to be small. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hand over mine, where it rested on his arm. Your mother used to say something, he told me. Whenever someone underestimated her, she'd say, they didn't reveal who I was, they revealed who they were. I thought about my husband looking at that table. About 2 years of silence I had chosen to interpret as patience, about all the versions of my future I had built in my head that required him to eventually, finally, become someone he had never actually been. I wasn't broken. That was what I hadn't expected. I had prepared myself for heartbreak, for grief, for the particular wreckage of a life you thought you were building. But what I actually felt, walking down those steps with the cool air on my face and my father steady beside me, was something closer to arrival. Like a room you hadn't realized you'd been locked out of, suddenly open. I had walked into that ballroom tonight as someone's wife, someone's project, someone's problem to be managed or erased. I was walking out as myself. The same person I had been before any of it started, the same person I would still be when everything that came next had been sorted through. Some things can only be recovered by letting go of what was hiding them. And I had been hidden long enough.